We're going to take a few minutes to talk about one of the high school units that comes up in the second half of the year, and that's the research writing unit. It looks a little different at each grade level, but some of the broad strokes of the work are similar, and so I want to unpack what some of those features are and how they work. We'll talk a little bit about the kinds of texts that show up in this work and how they're used, and what students are expected to do with their research work following that. One of the things that I like most about this unit is the way that it opens up opportunities for students to explore topics of interest to them, topics that are timely and relevant, that are local, that are personal. It's an interesting unit. But to get the most out of it, you'll certainly want to think about some parts of it ahead of time. At each grade level, the first thing students are working with is a text that serves as a sort of exemplar. To varying degrees, both the topic and the structure of this work are important to the work that students do with their own research afterward. One thing you'll notice about each of the texts is that they often incorporate a blended mode of writing. All of them are research-based, but some of them also include the first-person experiences of the writer. Some of them incorporate narrative elements in addition to what we traditionally understand as informational writing. We hope that you make use of these units as both an opportunity to teach and practice some traditional research-based writing skills, but also as an opportunity to break out of some of these static molds of traditional research papers in a high school setting. With these exemplar texts in the first part of the unit, you're going to see some familiar aspects of IBD curriculum. Students, for example, may be working through some chunking and retelling work, and they will be examining the author's implicit arguments in their writing. Students will have opportunities to discuss the text. You'll also see that there are some sessions dedicated to examining the author's methods in these texts. Students might be asked to look at how the author utilizes different types and sources of information, or they might examine the language that the writer uses to introduce a detail or a quote. This attention to craft is a deliberate foundation for work that they will be doing later in their own papers. At the conclusion of the first part of the unit, which is grounded in this exemplar text, students are introduced to the task that frames the second part of the unit. And this is where the work diverges from some of the patterns that you may have grown used to in earlier units. In Part 2, at most grade levels, they are no longer writing about or discussing the exemplar text specifically. Rather, they begin the process of exploring a topic or question related to the earlier text. So they might, for example, be reflecting on different kinds of cultural influences in their own community. Or they might be thinking about different innovations that have or haven't spread successfully. They might spend time considering the question of how or why people around them come to value certain ways of dressing or talking, or they might examine what it takes to learn something new by starting a learning project of their own. During this portion of the unit, the teacher's main role is to help coach students through different practices and processes of research and of drafting their writing. And because of this, it might take on a kind of writing workshop feel, as students pursue their own individual topics and work at slightly different paces. There are key parts of the work broken out as sub-assignments of the main task, and in some of these units, you will see a number of additional optional sessions included in the appendix of the unit. These are there to be used if and when they seem appropriate for your class. If you're watching this video as part of your initial planning for the unit, this would be a good time to open up your grade level unit, open up the student reader for the unit, and to take some time to look at the important planning features. In particular, I recommend reviewing the introduction for the unit, looking at the at a glance section to see how these sessions are organized, reviewing the major tasks for the unit, which you can find in the sessions and of course in the appendix, and at least taking some time to preview the text for the unit. As a heads up, the 11th grade unit has some structural differences from what I've described here. Many of these patterns are still present, but they play out in a slightly different way. So they might incorporate a brief group presentation in the middle of the unit, for example, before transitioning into their other research work. Now, if you haven't yet taken this first pass through the unit, you might block out about 20 minutes to do so now. That's not 20 minutes to come to a complete understanding of the unit and how every part of it works. That's 20 minutes to get a general idea of some of the main components that you're going to spend more time on in a moment. Once you've had the opportunity to review these pieces, you'll want to take some additional time in particular to A, read that exemplar text more thoroughly and with an eye toward the tasks that students will be doing with it, and B, to reflect on how the work of the second half of the unit will need to unfold in your classroom. By that, I mean that you can certainly anticipate some parts of the work that will be challenging for students. One of those parts is almost always going to be the idea generation phase. Some students will know fairly quickly what they are interested in and what they want to explore, while others will need some additional opportunities for reflection and some additional nudges along the way. Now, these are built into the sessions, but planning ahead for that challenge will help you meet it when it comes. Also, you'll need to be thinking ahead about what kinds of parameters you might want to place on this writing task. Again, much of this is laid out in the unit in terms of what kinds of topics or questions students will explore, what types of research they can incorporate, what types of work they will do along the way to build their final product. But there remain important parts of the task that you as the teacher will need to define for students. Do you have an absolute page length in mind? Will students be creating a presentation at the end of the unit using the optional sessions? How long and how much class time will students have for this work? Will you be using the informational writing rubric as you score these? Or do you plan to develop, or work with your colleagues to develop, a specific rubric for the research paper that incorporates your own unique requirements? If you're working with colleagues to plan ahead for this unit, this is a good time to start hammering out some of those particulars. Working with grade level partners will be most helpful, but having some vertical conversations is a good idea too, so you can think about how your expectations align and how students can extend their work into increasingly thoughtful and challenging work as they get older. So, once again, there are two parts to this. Reviewing the text used in the first part of the unit, and the work that goes with it in greater detail, and stopping to unpack exactly what your expectations are for the research writing project. If you have certain priority standards that you're focused on right now, or if you already know some goals that you have for student writing based on what you've already seen from them in the classroom, you should incorporate that thinking into your planning. And again, 11th grade teachers should watch for some slight differences in their unit. For example, students will need to specifically incorporate some of the author's ideas from the first part of the unit into their research-based writing. That's different from the other grade levels. Having an opportunity to meet together and to work with these units in an as-learner experience is always going to give us the strongest understanding of how these units play out. But this introduction should help paint some of the broad strokes of the work, and ideally, you'll be able to use some of these questions to think through the unit in advance and to spend some time in conversation with your peers. As we wrap up this talk, I encourage you to revisit those elements of the unit that I mentioned, and to think through exactly what your own expectations are for the major tasks. As in any learning experience where there is a lot of student choice and where there is student-directed research going on, there will always be some unexpected issues to resolve in the classroom. But if you follow students' interests and you maintain a little flexibility during some of the research process, we know that students can have a really powerful learning experience with this work.